Back when I was 21, during the summer before my senior year of college, I managed to get an internship at a financial firm downtown. It was a standard office job, lots of data entry and spreadsheets, but the pay was decent and it was a great addition to my resume. I worked in an open office area alongside 7 other interns. Our cubicles were packed together, providing just enough separation to make talking feel optional, but not enough for any real privacy. Out of the group, 5 of the interns were great, just normal college students who didn't take things too seriously. Then there was Eric, the guy who acted like every task was a matter of life or death, constantly typing away like he had a grudge against his keyboard. But the 7th intern, Felix, was in a league of his own. When I first met Felix, he seemed like your typical socially awkward guy. He was tall, lanky, and extremely pale, with a mess of dark hair that always looked like it needed a wash. He definitely didn't look like your average finance student, but that wasn't what made me uncomfortable. It was the way he behaved specifically toward me. At first, it was subtle. During the day, he'd suddenly appear at my cubicle. Because the dividers were low and he was so tall, he'd lean over the wall so that only his head was visible, looming over me like he was 7 feet tall. He'd tilt his head, fix me with a strange, frozen grin, and start talking in this bizarrely forced, creepy voice. I'd usually give a half-hearted laugh, pretending it was a joke, even though it felt completely out of place for a professional office. He'd say things like, "Working hard" or "Hardly working, Ronnie?" in that slow, unnatural tone, holding that stare for far too long. Initially, I brushed it off as him just being eccentric or trying too hard to be the funny guy. But as the days passed, it became a daily routine. At least once a day, I'd see his head slowly rise above the cubicle wall. That same stiff grin would be plastered on his face, followed by some incoherent or nonsensical conversation. The voice he used was soft yet taunting. Honestly, the best way to describe it is like the voice Charlie Hunnam used for his role as Ed Gein. The other interns noticed it, but they mostly laughed it off. I think they assumed Felix and I had some kind of inside joke or a rapport that they weren't part of. But for me, it felt different. It felt like I was being targeted as a private audience for his unsettling performance. As the weeks went by, his visits lasted longer. He'd lean over and just stare at me while talking, sometimes staying there for several minutes. I'd try to make excuses about finishing reports just to get him to leave, but he rarely took the hint. Then, about 6 weeks in, I was home eating dinner when my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I was expecting a delivery, so I picked up. For a few seconds, there was nothing but dead silence. Then, that familiar, forced, creepy voice came through the line. It was Felix. "The tide is coming in," he said, his voice rising almost to a shout. "Pull your boat out of the water." He dragged the words out like he was reciting some dark riddle, and then he let out this loud, completely unhinged laugh before hanging up. My skin crawled. It wasn't just the message. It was the fact that I had never given Felix my phone number. I texted the number back to ask if it was him, but the message failed to deliver. When I looked up the number, it turned out to be a landline. I was officially freaked out. How did he find my number, and why was he doing this? The following Monday, Felix didn't show up. His desk was empty all morning. Eventually, I went to my supervisor, Martin, and asked if it was possible for an intern to access employee contact info. Martin looked confused and told me that interns had no access to that kind of private data. He then informed me that they had actually fired Felix at the end of the previous week because he was failing to do any work and ignoring warnings. I told Martin about the strange phone call. He seemed genuinely shocked, and some of the other interns who overheard began to admit that Felix had made them feel uneasy too. Martin assured me that Felix was gone for good and had no reason to return. For about a week, I was on edge, expecting him to show up or send another message. But nothing happened. The office went back to its normal routine. I started to believe the ordeal was over, until one Friday morning around 5 a.m. It was still dark outside, with only a faint gray light hitting the blinds. I woke up to a faint noise coming from the backyard. I got out of bed and looked out the window. I immediately regretted it. Standing in the middle of my yard, between the trees and the porch light, was a figure staring directly up at my window. Even in the dim light, I knew it was Felix. He was standing perfectly still, his thin frame and messy hair unmistakable. I was paralyzed for a moment. Then I heard him call my name. He used that same sing-song, creepy voice he used at work, dragging out the syllables. As I reached for my phone to call 911, he tilted his head back and began to laugh. That same hysterical, terrifying laugh from the phone call. It sounded like someone who had completely lost touch with reality. I screamed through the window that I was calling the police and told him to get off my property, waving my phone so he could see it. He stood there for another second, then turned and walked calmly into the woods behind my house, still laughing as he disappeared. I called the police, but since he was gone and hadn't technically threatened me or broken in, they couldn't do much. They told me to call back if he returned. I never saw him again. Not at work, not in town, nowhere. I finished my internship and was even offered a permanent job there, which I initially accepted, though I eventually moved on to a different company after graduation. It's been a few years now, but the image of him standing in my backyard still haunts me. I still wonder how he got my personal information and what his actual intentions were that morning. I've tried to convince myself that he was just dealing with a severe mental illness, but that doesn't make the memory any less chilling. I'll never forget the sound of that laughter echoing in the dark, like a joke that only a madman could understand. I was only 17 when this happened. It was my first real job, working at a local grocery store in a quiet Vermont town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else and nothing ever really happens. At first, I enjoyed the work. It was simple, and most of my coworkers were friendly. During the slow hours, we'd all gather near the front of the store to chat, complain about customers, or talk about what we were watching on TV. Those moments were a nice break from the monotony of staring at a cash register all day. Depending on the supervisor, the atmosphere was either relaxed or strict. On the chill shifts, people would be on their phones or socializing by the front. There was one coworker I didn't know very well at first, a guy named Alex. He was 24, a bit awkward, and always seemed to miss social cues. He was growing his hair out, and it sat at that messy, in-between length just above his shoulders. He worked in the dairy section, so we didn't have much reason to interact. He was quiet and polite enough, so I didn't think much of him. Eventually, I was added to a coworker group chat. It was mostly just work-related stuff and dumb jokes, but soon after, Alex started messaging me directly. It seemed harmless at first, asking about my shifts or if I was covering for someone. But over the next few weeks, it became clear he was trying to get closer. He started asking personal questions about my life, my hobbies, and what I did on my weekends. I tried to be polite, thinking it was just small talk, but the tone felt off. He started calling me cute in ways that made me uncomfortable and making jokes that felt slightly flirty. It bothered me because I was only 17 and he was much older, but I didn't think anyone else noticed. His persistence grew annoying. He'd comment on everything I posted online and send messages late at night. I didn't want to make things awkward at work, so I mostly ignored him. One day, I was at home binge-watching Stranger Things. my favorite show. I hadn't told anyone at work that I was catching up on the latest season. A few days later, while we were all chatting at the front of the store about TV shows, Alex suddenly looked at me and asked, "You like Stranger Things, right?" I froze. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I couldn't remember ever mentioning the show to him or anyone else at the store. I just nodded slowly, trying to brush it off, but I felt sick. How did he know? He just gave an awkward smile and walked back to the dairy section like nothing had happened. But from that moment on, I knew he was watching me much more closely than I had realized. The real fear set in a few nights later. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard a faint scraping sound against my bedroom window. At first, I thought it was just a tree branch or the wind. But then I heard it again, a distinct, deliberate tapping on the glass. I crept over and peeked through the blinds, half expecting to see Alex standing there, but the yard was empty. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about his question at work. How could he know what I was watching in the privacy of my own room? A couple of days later, he texted me again. This time, I didn't ignore it. I told him clearly and firmly that I wasn't interested. His response was immediate and terrifying. He replied, "Okay, good luck changing your address." I was stunned. In that one impulsive text, he confirmed my worst fears. I immediately took screenshots of the messages. I went straight to my manager and explained everything. He was shocked and promised to handle it. My dad and I also went to the local police to file a report, explaining the stalking and the incident at my window. The next day, Alex was called into the office and fired on the spot. The police began the paperwork for a restraining order. I thought I'd feel relieved, but the fear didn't just go away. I started obsessively double-checking locks and refused to answer any unknown calls. Every little noise outside at night made me jump. Months passed without any further incidents. The restraining order seemed to work, and Alex never tried to contact me again. Slowly, my life returned to normal. I stopped checking my window every night and eventually stopped thinking about him altogether. But the experience left a lasting mark. Even years later, I am hyper-aware of my surroundings and cautious of new people, especially those who seem harmlessly awkward. Looking back, the scariest part wasn't what he did, but how quickly a seemingly normal person could turn into a source of terror. It starts with small, innocent-seeming questions and can escalate into something far more dangerous. I work in a different town now and live in a new apartment. I don't talk to anyone from that grocery store anymore, but sometimes lying in bed at night I still remember that tapping on the glass. It's a reminder of how quickly your sense of safety can vanish, even in a quiet town where nothing is supposed to happen. If you ever feel a coworker is crossing a line, trust your instincts. Don't brush it off as awkwardness. It might just save you from months of fear, or worse. When I was 27, I started working at a small insurance office in a quiet part of Ohio. It was the kind of office tucked away behind a strip mall, one long row of desks, flickering fluorescent lights, and the constant smell of stale coffee. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid the bills, and the work was easy enough on slow days when the phones barely rang. I usually worked the day shift, but one particular Friday, I was scheduled to stay late to help clear a backlog of client records. There was a major storm warning that day, the kind that dominates the local news. When I woke up that morning and saw the sky, I knew it was going to be a dark one. By 3 p.m., the rain was pouring so heavily you couldn't see the end of the street, and thunder was already making the windows rattle. Surprisingly, I was actually enjoying the atmosphere of the storm. As the weather grew worse, the manager decided to let most of the staff head home early. However, A couple of us volunteered to stay and finish the paperwork. The only other person who remained was a guy named Tom, who had only started working with us about 2 weeks prior. Tom was in his early 30s, tall, quiet, and had a way of being off-putting that I couldn't quite put into words. I wouldn't have called him creepy back then, just strange. He didn't talk much, but he always seemed to be nearby. If I went to the break room for coffee, he'd appear 2 minutes later. If I was restocking the printer, he'd show up pretending to do the same. I brushed it off as social awkwardness. By 5 p.m., the storm was in full force. Lightning flashed every few seconds, followed by thunder that made the floor vibrate beneath my feet. The office felt eerily empty. Tom sat a few rows away, typing what looked like complete nonsense on his screen. Every time I glanced up, I noticed him watching me. Around 6:30, the power began to flicker. We both let out a nervous laugh when the lights dimmed, but he didn't say a word. The next flicker lasted much longer, and then the office went completely dark. The only sound was the heavy drumming of rain on the roof. The emergency lights eventually kicked in, bathing everything in a dim orange glow. I mentioned that it was probably a good time to leave, but Tom didn't respond. Instead, I heard the jingle of keys, followed by the distinct sound of the front door being locked. He muttered that it wasn't safe to go outside yet. I tried to tell myself he was just being helpful, but the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. I went to grab my things, the building now feeling much smaller in the dark. When I returned to the front, Tom was standing by the glass door, staring out into the pitch-black parking lot. I told him I was going to call my boyfriend to let him know I'd be late, but again, he said nothing. When I tried my cell phone, there was no signal. The storm must have knocked out the tower. I tried the landline, but the line was dead. As I turned to walk back to the main office, I nearly jumped out of my skin. Tom was standing right in the doorway. I hadn't heard a single footstep. He was holding a small flashlight under his chin, casting grotesque shadows across his face. He had a faint, unsettling smile. I forced a nervous laugh and asked him again to unlock the door so I could head home. He refused, insisting it was better to wait until the worst of the storm passed. My heart started racing. I retreated to my cubicle to pack my bag, trying to stay calm and waiting for any lull in the rain to make my move. A few minutes later, I noticed Tom was gone. Thinking he might be in the restroom, I seized the chance and ran toward the back exit. But when I reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. The door had been chained and padlocked from the inside, something we never did. Then, I saw the faint glow of a flashlight moving down the hallway. Panicked, I ducked into a supply closet near the break room and shut the door silently. I tried to stifle my breathing as I heard Tom's slow, deliberate footsteps in the hall. He started calling my name in a voice that was disturbingly calm, claiming he just wanted to make sure I was safe. I stayed frozen. Through the gap under the closet door, I saw his flashlight beam pass by, then disappear. Suddenly, a massive crack of thunder shook the entire building. The sound of rain intensified, and I realized part of the roof above the break room was leaking. I waited about 10 minutes before I dared to peek out. The hallway was empty. I crept back toward the front of the office, and when I turned the corner, I stopped dead. The front glass door had been completely shattered. Rain was blowing inside, soaking the carpet. Tom was nowhere to be seen. I didn't wait to find out where he was. I sprinted through the broken glass into the torrential rain, scrambled into my car, and sped out of the lot without looking back. The next morning, I called my manager. He didn't believe me until he saw the damage himself. The police were called, and I gave them my statement. They found Tom's car still in the parking lot, unlocked, with his keys, phone, and wallet still inside. They also discovered that the security cameras had been manually turned off before the power went out. Tom was never seen again. Some coworkers thought he had a mental breakdown, but I've always wondered if he had been planning something far worse for me that night. I quit a month later. I couldn't stand being in that enclosed space anymore. Even now, whenever a storm hits and the lights flicker, I can still hear the sound of those keys locking the door.